And I'm really happy to present Mattia and Beth. I've seen them once and I had wanted to see them another time, and their conference presentation was so overloaded that they weren't letting any more people in the space. So I knew it must have been a good one. So I'm really excited to have them both here today. And I don't think that you will be just sitting there listening. So everybody put on your chat texting fingers and we're gonna get going. Here you go.
Great, thank you so much, Hope. It's so nice to see so many of you. We met some of you at New Paltz. We met some of you in the SUNY online conference before the pandemic hit. So for those of you who we met, it's great to see you again. And for those of you who we're meeting for the first time, thank you so much for being with us this morning. If you don't have your chat up on screen, please click the tab, because we're going to jump right in and talk about how we can build community online, particularly in a short amount of time with people that you may not know, and how we can do that through community agreements. We'll move into community building, and then we're going to talk a little bit about how to be mindful of microaggressions in online exchanges. So Hope, can we move to the next slide, please? So the origin of community agreements, for those of you who have ever done mutual aid or group work, they're sometimes known as group agreements. And it's when folks come together from a position of empowerment. You know, none of us love to follow rules. And so if you are the facilitator of the exchange setting down rules, it can be an automatic, not sure if I buy into that. So community agreements, which we will be setting in just a moment, are about how we can come together from our different positions to cultivate a respectful environment. They're meant to be dynamic and organic. So this is your touchstone for every session, whether it's like today, one session, or if you're doing a 10-session webinar or a 15-week class. So it's something you always come back to. In every session, you're going to ask your participants to agree to them. And you may, in fact, every time you meet, edit them. And you can even take turns editing them, typing them up. And not only does it really help build community, but it eases pressure on you if you're the facilitator. What it's meant to do is really have shared power. And then when there is conflict in your group, it eases the pressure on who the facilitator is siding with, because you're coming back to the agreements. That's really your touchstone and where you're going to work in resolving conflict. It's particularly great when you're working with folks from different cultural backgrounds, which I know Gail and Molly are going to talk about cultural humility in a few minutes. Community agreements really help ground everyone in the same place. So next slide, please, Hope. So we are going to ask all of you to engage in this exercise with us this morning, and we'll take about 90 seconds or so to set two types of agreements: relational and operational. Relational ones are, how do we want to be together over the next 90 minutes? And operational are, what is the structure? So go ahead and open up your chat. Mattia is going to be our chat data manager for this portion of the presentation, and type in what would help you feel comfortable in sharing and being part of our exchange this morning.
And we have one next slide before we get to that too.
Oh, great. Thanks. You know what, Hope, can you move to the next one? So when we're thinking about how we're going to structure our community, we like to use the term brave versus safe, because for one, in the COVID-19 pandemic, none of us particularly are feeling safe. A lot is very much outside of our control. When we are in a virtual environment, as the facilitator of the exchange, we can't really guarantee that people are going to feel safe, because we don't control what other people say or type or how they are in the space. So how can we be brave together? How can we be respectful? What can we commit to that is anti-oppressive and enhances civility? And we're going to talk about other microaggressions, but using the term safe space in itself can be a microaggression, because it assumes, as the facilitators, we know what safety looks like. And we can't, as the facilitators of this informational exchange, know what that safety looks like. So as we set up our one community agreement is that we all try and show up and be brave together. So think about what would help facilitate our communication this morning, what you'd like to get out of it, and please feel free to type it in chat.
And
So
I hope,
stay on the screen or go back one?
I'll go a forward one.
Okay.
You're going to have to hit escape on presenter view because when we're typing in, it won't show up on the slide.
Okay.
Yep, there we go. Thank you.
Sure. So can you say once again what you want people to do?
Sure. So think about what would help us come together and build community this morning. So relational might be honoring folks' names, introducing ourselves, being vulnerable to turn your camera on if you feel comfortable or in a space where you can. And operational might be saying goodbye before you leave. Relational is about how we are in the space, and an operational community agreement is how we are together. So for example, Paul typed in chat, how can we connect with folks outside of here? That would be operational. Maybe everyone can share their email address they're most comfortable with so that we can stay in community after this morning. Great, so Heba says being good listeners, and Dave is saying, can we be thoughtful about our language? These are fantastic, thank you. So empathic, relevant chat, I love that. I would say that's relational and operational. Being brave, identifying a common way to show that we want to say something, fantastic. So that can be committing to a hand raise maybe, or using the hand raise icon. And I want to thank my co-presenter Mattia for jumping right in and typing so voraciously to get everyone's agreements on screen. Wonderful, asking respectfully to repeat something. Practice smiling. We'll take another 30 seconds or so. And then what we're going to do is we're going to ask if, as a community this morning, we can all agree to these for today. And if you could either click in your reactions, for those of you familiar with Zoom, at the bottom you'll see a little icon that says reactions. It's got a happy face with a plus. If you would give a thumbs up. If you are unfamiliar with Zoom, we'll ask you for a hand raise if you're comfortable.
Beth, do you want me to switch off so everybody can see each other? I can do that.
One more call if anyone else has anything to type into chat before we switch. Gabby, thank you. Yes, being mindful of language differences. Okay, great. Yes, that'd be great to switch, Hope. Thank you.
Okay. Let's see. Stop sharing. So, do you want people to raise their hands again, or do you want to go back to the...
If everyone could take a minute to look at what we have and then either use the hand raise icon or gesture in some way that we commit to these for the morning.
Here, let me just throw that back up. So here it is.
So there's my thumbs up.
And then okay.
Great, I'm starting to see lots of thumbs up and acknowledgement. Fantastic, thank you. Okay, so we're gonna, normally if we had more time, we wanna be, one of our community agreements is to be respectful of time and our co-presenters. So normally if we had more time, we would spend some time unpacking what was here versus what's missing. And this is a great way, regardless of if it's an educational exchange, if you're coming together for team building, a wonderful way to start coming together as a community. So Hope, I'm going to ask you to move to the next slide, please. So with your students, and this is K through 12 and also in higher ed, this is something you can do, and it's really fun to do with the itty bitties. They have great rules. One of my favorites with my pediatric clients is chew with your mouth closed and don't eat on camera. We do a lot of snacks in virtual sessions. So great advice in the world, but this is a really wonderful way of saying we are coming together as a group. And these are the expectations. We all feel more comfortable and more vulnerable being brave if we know what's expected. So in today's world, as many of us are working from home, some of the questions we might want to unpack in our community agreements is, can your family be in the room? This is coming up in my institution around student advisement. For the first time, we have parents, grandparents, aunts, and uncles who are coming into advising sessions and sharing what they think should happen. So we're having to set some structure around what that looks like and how helpful it is. Are you in your pajamas? What is your space? Are you sitting outside? What's background noise? Expectations and being really clear on them is going to help you build a community more rapidly, which we're really being asked to do in today's environment. So we're going to share one last example before I turn it over to Mattia, who's going to continue talking about building community and microaggressions, because that's one of the most quick ways that our community can be eroded is through constant microaggressions in a virtual environment. So Hope, can you move to the next slide? So some other examples, and this is related more to work in the workplace, not just educational environments, is sharing what's learned, focusing on each other's strengths, protecting the space, and then also acknowledging hurt. And so I'm going to turn it over to Mattia, who's going to address that. What happens when folks get hurt in our virtual learning space and how we can move forward with some restorative healing to focus on our learning goals while also attending to the emotional piece.
Great, thank you, Beth, and thank you, Hope. So the chalkboard image was just sort of as a touchstone, because sometimes folks can connect to, when you're in a physical group, you will do community agreements on a chalkboard. And we modeled one way you might do community agreements online. So on the next slide, I just want to show you that these are some agreements that include the tech. So we had some tech agreements for ourselves here today, and other tech agreements include, you know, maybe typos. Sometimes people feel like I can't type in the chat if I am not doing it perfectly, or they feel like it's rude to type into the chat. So yeah, there's different cultural expectations about what's appropriate with chat behavior, and it can be really helpful, as Beth said, to just lay that out up front. For the next slide, we like to encourage bringing the community agreements back. So I've done community agreements with students, and they say like, "Oh, we always do community agreements and then we never see them again." And I have always said, well, guess what? We're going to see it every week and even between classes too. So I always review them at the start of every class session, and we'll make changes. For example, I was teaching a course this semester, and week 1 was like the normal world, and then we had spring break, and then week 2, suddenly there was a pandemic. And so we added a community agreement that was forgive each other, we're all going through a hard time, which and that came from the students. I thought that was a really lovely addition. So having it at the start of every session is really helpful. And then I included in grading rubrics. So if I'm grading class participation on 10 points, I'll take a couple points and dedicate them to following the community agreements. In discussion forums, I do that as well. So, and it's really helpful because, as Beth pointed out, you know, there's going to be conflict in a class. It's just, you know, anytime you have people, there's going to be disagreements and conflict. And it's really helpful if your community agreements address, you know, when there's a conflict in a class, let's approach it in this or that way. And I imagine that that's pretty helpful also if you're going across cultures. So let's go to the next slide. So fitting community agreements into the overall course community building is, it's really helpful because it just sets the tone right up front. So creating the community agreements together and then laying out how you're going to revisit them then sets the tone to being able to build community throughout the semester. Maybe you're building community through kind of fun activities in class or through conversations or however is going to be appropriate for your age group and your cultural context. I think it's so cool. In my breakout group earlier, one of my colleagues was talking about doing this with middle school students, for example, and it's just so cool to imagine how these virtual exchanges are wonderful for students across the spectrum of ages. So I just love that. And thinking about other ways to build community will depend on your particular group. And just as a note, especially when you've built this wonderful community, closing the community is really important. So we try to encourage thinking of ways together to come up with a way you want to close out. So for the next slide, we've got a quick definition of microaggressions. We weren't sure if everyone is familiar with that, what a microaggression is. So we will just quickly share that microaggressions are usually unintentional. Usually people mean well, but then they say something that conveys a message that a particular person is an outsider or a particular person doesn't belong. Like, you know, I have a mixed racial background, and so I often get told like, wow, your English is so good. And that to me conveys the impression that people don't think of me as somebody who would know how to speak English upon first view, but you know, I'm a native English speaker, so grew up in the US. So it is not surprising that I could speak English well. So that's an example. And people, you know, often will say that in a way that it's like, oh, they're trying to give me a compliment. But instead of giving me a compliment, they've kind of made me feel like an outsider. So that's an example. So for the next slide, so preparing to respond to microaggressions is really important because when it happens in the moment, if you're the person leading the group, it can feel like, something just happened. What am I supposed to do? So just a little bit of pre-prep to have your routine in place can be really useful. And also just acknowledging that you might notice a microaggression in the moment, but you know, we're human beings and we're, you know, our attention is split, especially when we're working with groups. So it might be that, you know, something happens in the chat and you don't notice it until after and you read through the chat, or it's in a discussion forum and you're not reading the discussion forum every minute of every day, so you don't notice it right away. Or you might not even realize it was a microaggression, so you're relying on and a student comes to you later and says, hey, a microaggression happened. So it's totally okay to deal with them afterwards, as long as you do deal with them. So on the next slide, we have oh, sorry.
You know, Mattia, someone just brought up a question that talks about exactly what you were just referring to. I've never used community agreements before. Does anyone feel like community agreements operate differently if there's asynchronous versus synchronous? And so you were just talking about that. And so it sounds like, do you handle that differently?
Yeah, so I'm really glad that you brought that up, and thanks for raising it too. If you're doing it like a completely asynchronous course, for example, you might have students email in what they'd like to be the community agreements to you as the instructor or a group leader, and then you can put them together and show them to the students and say, look, this is what we've got so far. What additions do you want to make? What questions do you have? Maybe they're using particular language and not everyone knows what something means. And so you can still have a discussion about it, like an asynchronous discussion. And what I really like about community agreements is it sort of helps us unpack, like, what does it mean to be respectful? What does that look like? In a discussion forum, is it respectful if you give a short comment that says, I really like your idea, or is it dismissive because you didn't say anything about what the idea was? In a chat, is it respectful if you don't chat because you're listening, or is it respectful if you chat a lot because it shows that you're engaging? You know, everyone comes with really different expectations about that.
Thank you.
I I wanted to quickly jump in and acknowledge what Rosa said about never using community agreements. I actually just had an experience. I only use them online. I don't use them in residential teaching. And I got my final class feedback from a residential course that I taught pre-pandemic, and they all said, I wish we'd had a document that agreed when people spoke up too much versus those of us who were quiet. And I thought, my goodness, it never even occurred to me to use them residentially. So that's a change I'm going to make for the fall. And I think that if you have a text-based discussion board, whether it's residentially or virtual, having it pinned kind of at the top of your course site and then asking folks to review it and confirm they reviewed it in the discussion board itself is a really helpful kind of touchstone as well.
Thank you. That's a really great point. Having it very, within easy access, really visible. So we really like this tool, and there are links in the slides too, so you can take a look later. But the name steps were done by some of our colleagues in the field of social work, and they refer to one.
I'm going to mute the video just a minute.
They refer to one particular context, but you can use it for anything, and it's nice and simple, and it's just a nice way to feel prepared if a microaggression happens in the moment. So just notice. So NAME stands for notice that something happened, and maybe you notice right away, or maybe you notice later. Acknowledge. So as the group leader, it is your responsibility to help the group name it and address it. M for make space, so giving students a chance to reflect on what happened and kind of create some meaning around it. And then E, engage the group, engage in some kind of discussion, asynchronous discussion or in-person or live virtual discussion, whatever works for your particular context. And it's just such a nice, simple tool. So we just love that. And I think we're out of time. The next slide just has a reference for later if you want to read a case of responding to a microaggression, and then we're on to Q&A. And huge thanks to everyone.
Yes, thank you. Wendy, I see your question in chat, and I think what Mattia and I will do is post our responses in chat so that Molly and Gail can come on up. So that's a great question. Thank you.
Okay. I'm just going to take a moment. I think it would be great if we just get a moment to see each other, and while we change the slides. And so if you do have a question, please go ahead right now and ask, and I'm just gonna refresh the slides. And okay, there is another question in the chat. Do you see that, Mattia? Do you want to answer that?
Sure. So I see Elizabeth made a really great point. And then Wendy's question about, is it tricky to dedicate the time? I would say it is an investment of your instructional time. So that's a trade-off, but it's really valuable because, especially I think in intercultural exchanges, which is basically every exchange, there's going to be some kind of misunderstanding or conflict. And so having the agreements to refer back to is really helpful. And also having the agreements to refer to before you go into a sensitive conversation. So for example, I've taught a course on racial identity development. And before we would go into small group breakout discussions, we always reviewed the community agreements so that everyone was on the same page. And, we agreed, okay, so if we don't understand something, we'll ask. If we weren't sure what you meant, we'll try to assume good intentions, but the impact of what you said might be different from what you intended the impact to be. So we're going to understand that we're going to ask each other and use opportunities for teaching moments. So sometimes people don't agree, or sometimes they don't understand what a community agreement means. And that's actually really valuable because then you're having the discussion about it up front before people are kind of in a heated moment. So I once had a community agreement discussion take half an hour because we couldn't agree what respect meant. And talking about respect, that was a really cool moment. Like, it's really memorable to me. And we talked about what does respect look like when you're commenting peer-to-peer, and what respect looks like, in a group discussion. And it was really helpful to just lay that all out. And we felt like we understood each other better, because understanding how someone feels respected is it's profound and it meant a lot. So even though it took a good amount of time, we had to reschedule a few things, you know, and because I run a tight ship with my agendas, I'm like minute to minute. It was worth it. It was really, really worth it.